Hi, and welcome to our week on the presidency and gender. For this time, we're going to discuss women executives in the comparative context, gendered media coverage and opinions, how to even measure bias, and finally, the role of sexism in recent elections. So in the comparative context, we can see many instances of women as the executives in their country. And Jalazeh argues that there are a few predictors for why we see women as executives in some countries, but not others. And there are really three reasons. The first is structural, the second is institutional, and finally is personal. And we're going to delve into each of these. The first is that women's education, when we talk about structural, we mean that women's education and employment is related to representation in legislatures. So, in places where women are more educated and participate in the labor force at higher rates, we would expect for women to be in more positions of power, particularly in the legislature. But this may not be as true for executives, but is certainly true when it comes to legislatures. The second is institutional. Women are more likely to serve in parliamentary systems than presidential systems. This is because in parliamentary systems, the executive is selected from within the party or party coalition by other party members, right, by other legislators. Compare this to presidential systems, though, where the electorate chooses, and it's much, much more difficult to find support for a woman candidate in the general public than it is to, say, find support from the 150 party members who serve in parliament with you. And the final one is personal, particularly as it relates to kinship ties. We're just more likely to see women gain power when their fathers or husbands were also executives. We're more likely to see women come to power in unstable regimes when they're related to a current or former executive. This is because instability means that there are more chances for a new leader generally. If there's lots of political turmoil and there's someone new in power every year, that makes for more chances for a woman to come to power. Compare this to, say, our system where someone is elected every 4 years. There are just fewer opportunities compared to if there's turnover every year. And if your system is unstable, then having a relationship to a previous executive gives a related woman an advantage in some respects. Now, beyond these institutional, structural, and personal reasons for women coming into power or not, there's also the role of how our presidency in the US is gendered. So, for instance, when asked what characteristics people say they want in the presidency, what the presidency is composed of, what their timbre is, per your reading, people tend to list or describe masculine traits. They're describing a masculine institution, whether they realize it or not. Your reading specifically describes the presidency as being associated with masculinity in two different forms. The first is dominance, so dominance masculinity, where the president is dominating, controlling, and commanding. The second is expertise masculinity, where there's instead hegemony through mastery. Women will oftentimes not be able to compete along dimensions of dominance masculinity, but will be more likely able to do so with expertise masculinity. This dominance masculinity is more in demand in the wake of foreign conflicts. So think of September 11th. And there is actually research that shows that there was a penalty for women candidates after 9/11 because there was more demand for sort of this dominance masculinity. But if people prefer dominance masculinity, women are going to be less in demand from the electorate. But if a woman is perceived as dominant with dominance masculinity, she may come across as too aggressive, and then she will be punished electorally. Conventionally, expertise has mattered less and dominance was more important in presidential elections, but that has started to shift in recent years. For instance, in 2012, there was more of an emphasis on expertise masculinity with, say, Mitt Romney than dominance masculinity, suggesting that women might actually have more space to compete for president through the lens of expertise masculinity as opposed to dominance masculinity. Now, we're going to delve into each of these bullet points a bit more in our discussion section, but both the media and the electorate tend to judge women candidates differently compared to men candidates. For instance, many times women will be held to a higher standard in terms of experience. There's also this sort of odd balance they have to strike between being tough and nice. Moreover, discussion of women being commander-in-chief often devolves into them being too emotional to have control over the button, or them being too hormonal to be responsible for foreign affairs. They also must strike an odd balance with family. People want to see them carrying with a family, but they also don't want them to have a family that will distract from their duties. The same expectation is just not there for men candidates. And finally, there's sexuality, where oftentimes women have to de-emphasize their sexuality through things like pantsuits per your reading, but there's also some demand for women candidates to be sexualized in some way. It's a really odd balance to strike. And again, we're going to delve into each of these a bit more in discussion section. Now, even though the electorate tends to have biased views of women candidates, these are actually quite difficult, these biased views. They're difficult to measure. No one wants to explicitly say that they're biased against women, right? Like in a survey. And as noted by Jalazeh, she says support for our female presidential candidate is exaggerated given pressures on respondents to offer socially desirable responses. But I'm going to describe a few ways in which we as political scientists circumvent that and measure bias against women presidential candidates in surveys. The first is the item count method. You can see that in the left-hand set of questions, people are asked how many of the following items people disapprove of. The way gasoline prices keep going up, professional athletes getting $1 million plus salaries, requiring seatbelts to be used when driving, large corporations polluting the environment. Now, let's say that I personally disagree with the way gasoline prices keep going up and professional athletes getting $1 million plus salaries. I would then note down on my survey too that I disapprove of two. I don't need to identify which ones I disapprove. I just need to tell you the number of items that I disapprove of. And in this case, I disapprove of two. Now you'll see that in the second panel, there's one more added to the same list, a woman running for president. I'll ask people how many items on the list people disapprove of. Now, let's say I'm biased against women running for president, in addition to not disapproving of gasoline prices and professional athletes, I would put down 3, right? I don't need to say, which ones I disapprove of. I just need to put down a number. And in this case, I disapprove of 3 of these. This helps mitigate that social desirability bias that would be there if I just asked you approve or disapprove of a woman running for president. People are likely to say, I approve of a woman running for president, whereas this sort of helps hide which items people disagree with. So, and what I would do is randomly assign, half of my respondents to the first list and then my other half to the second list. And if people don't have bias against women running for president, then we would expect the average number of items that people disapprove of to be the same across the two groups. But we actually don't see that occur. Research from probably about 10 years ago shows that this second group has a higher number of things that they disapprove of compared to the first group, which means that people at that point were not as supportive of women running for president. A second measure of bias against women, not necessarily women running for president, but women generally, is implicit bias. So implicit biases are almost like the biases that we're really unaware of and oftentimes work in the background of cognition. And one way to measure these, this is a flawed test, but still I want to bring it up, is with implicit association tests. And they measure how much you associate some groups with certain words. So for instance, we're looking at how much women are associated with career or family in people's minds, and it measures how quickly you associate women or women's names with having a career or a profession versus how quickly you associate men or men's names with having a career or a profession. And if you have sort of implicit biases against women, you'll have slower times that connect women or women's names with career. And what we can see here is implicit gender biases across this graph. The higher it is along the y-axis, the more implicit biases you have against women. So more higher means more biased. And along the x-axis is the ideological spectrum, going from liberal over here to conservative over here. And as we can see here, all of these up here are women, and women have greater implicit biases against women than men, right? Isn't that sort of counterintuitive? Women have more biases against women than men. And white conservative women tend to have the greatest implicit bias against women. Now, if you recall from last week when we discussed the presidency and race, there's a piece from Brian Schaffner in our video lecture about how racism and sexism shaped vote choice in 2016. And just to be clear, party ID and ideology, party ID and ideology are controlled for. But Brian Schaffner is examining how racism and sexism shape vote choice in 2016 when controlling for party and ideology. And Schaffner uses a measure of hostile sexism, which this is usually a battery of questions, and it asks about whether women exaggerate problems at work, women being too easily offended, women interpreting innocent remarks as sexist, women losing fairly and then claiming discrimination, whether women seek special favors under the guise of equality, feminists making reasonable demands, feminists not seeking more power than men, women seeking power by gaining control over men, whether women tease men sexually, whether once a man commits, she puts him on a tight leash. Those are the actual words of the question. And whether women fail to appreciate men for all they do for them. So that was a whole battery. Like that's a really exhaustive list. But I want to give you an idea, like we just talked about, like the item count method and implicit biases with implicit association tests. And then this one is hostile sexism. So it's not explicitly asking like, do you approve or disapprove of having a woman as president, but it's rather a measure of sexism within the respondent. And Schaffner here finds that sexism, when controlling for ideology and party ID, does predict vote choice in the 2016 election. In other words, people who score higher for hostile sexism are less likely to support Clinton in the 2016 election. And here, looking at the R-squared, hostile sexism predicts about 29% and 37% of the variation in the dependent variable, which is vote choice. This means that this hostile sexism is a fairly strong predictor of vote choice for the presidential election in 2016, which makes sense because it is the first woman candidate from the two major parties. Interestingly, Schaffner has another piece in which he examines the role of sexism in vote choice, but he's not looking at the presidential election. He's looking at the midterms after 2016. So the piece is called "The Heightened Importance of Racism and Sexism in the 2018 Midterm Elections," and he's looking specifically at the role of sexism in vote choice in the 2018 midterms. Now, for the House vote in 2016, hostile sexism doesn't predict vote choice, or it's not as good of a predictor as other factors for your House vote in 2016. But by 2018, hostile sexism does actually become a good predictor of vote choice in House elections, which I think is an interesting finding, with individuals who are more sexist being more likely to support the Republican House candidate. So this time we covered women executives in the comparative context, specifically how institutional, structural, and personal factors affect whether a woman is elected. Then we discussed how bias influences whether we elect a woman as president, with a focus on gendered media coverage and opinions, how we measure bias and the role of sexism in recent elections, both presidential and non-presidential. Now, for the discussion section, we're going to talk about Jalal-Zay's findings and what they mean for the U.S., those sort of unique standards that women are held to when running for president, and the gender gap, as well as measurements of sexism and how that might affect vote choice. But I will see you all in our last discussion section.